Marcus Chen never expected to wake up screaming at 3 in the morning, 15 years after the last shot was fired in humanity's bloodiest interstellar conflict. Yet here he was, drenched in cold sweat, his wife Sarah gently shaking his shoulder as their bedroom walls seemed to close in around him. The dreams always started the same way. The metallic taste of recycled air in his combat suit, the endless gray expanse of Kepler 442b's surface stretching toward a horizon that never seemed real. And then the sounds, the terrible, inhuman sounds that came from both sides of the conflict. Sarah had learned not to ask about the nightmares anymore. She would simply hold him until his breathing returned to normal, her fingers tracing the network of scars that mapped his back like a constellation of pain. Some were from enemy plasma burns. Others were from the modifications humanity had made to its own soldiers. Marcus worked as a civilian contractor now, helping design sustainable habitats for colony worlds. It was peaceful work, the kind that built things instead of destroying them. His colleagues respected his military background but never pressed for details. The official records were classified, and Marcus preferred it that way. But today was different. Today, Admiral Rebecca Torres was coming to visit. The message had arrived through encrypted channels, requesting a private meeting at his home office. Torres had been his commanding officer during the Centauri campaign, the woman who had made the hardest decisions any human had ever been asked to make. She was also the one person alive who truly understood what Marcus carried with him. When she arrived, Torres looked older than her 62 years. The war had aged everyone who survived it, but command had taken an especially heavy toll. Her once sharp military bearing had softened into something more human, though her eyes still held that calculating intelligence that had saved countless lives. "You look well, Marcus," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Through the window behind her, he could see Sarah tending their small garden, deliberately giving them privacy. "I manage," Marcus replied. "Sarah helps. The work helps." Torres nodded, understanding the weight behind those simple words. "I'm here because they want to declassify some of the Centauri records, Congressional Committee on Wartime Ethics. They think enough time has passed." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The Centauri campaign had been humanity's turning point in the war, the moment they stopped losing and started winning. It was also the moment they had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony, your perspective on what we did out there." Torres leaned forward. "Marcus, they're calling it genocide. They're saying we became monsters." The word hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Genocide. Marcus had wrestled with that term for 15 years, turning it over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by endless handling. "Were they wrong?" he asked quietly. Torres was silent for a long moment. The Zephyrians had overrun 12 colony worlds, 3 billion dead. Their bioweapons were turning our own soldiers into living weapons against us. Command estimated we had maybe 6 months before they reached Earth. Marcus remembered. The Zephyrians had been unlike any enemy humanity had ever faced. Not malicious exactly, but utterly alien in their understanding of warfare. They treated biological modification like artists treated paint, reshaping captured humans into grotesque extensions of their will. Traditional military doctrine had proven useless against an enemy that could turn your own forces against you. And then Dr. Reyes had her breakthrough, Marcus said. The neural disruptor technology, a way to sever the Zephyrian collective consciousness. Torres's voice was clinical, but Marcus could hear the old pain underneath. It worked perfectly, too perfectly. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the first field test. The Zephyrian forces had simply stopped. Not just the soldiers, but every Zephyrian in the system. They had collapsed where they stood, their shared consciousness shattered like glass. What humanity had thought was a weapon against military forces had turned out to be a weapon against an entire species. "We didn't know," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. "We couldn't have known their entire civilization was linked through quantum entanglement." "Couldn't we?" Torres asked. Dr. Reyes had warned us about the possibility. Command chose to proceed anyway. The weight of that decision had fallen on field commanders like Torres, but it had been soldiers like Marcus who had pulled the triggers. He remembered standing on that battlefield, watching Zephyrian civilians, if that term even applied to their collective existence, falling like wheat before a scythe. 37 billion, Torres said quietly. That's the current estimate. 37 billion sentient beings wiped out in 17 minutes. Marcus opened his eyes. And humanity survived. Yes, we survived. Torres stood, walking to the window where Sarah was now picking tomatoes. The question the committee is asking is whether survival justifies what we did, whether the threat was real enough to warrant that. Marcus joined her at the window. Sarah looked up and waved, her face brightening with the smile that had kept him anchored to sanity for 15 years. Behind her, their neighbors' children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. "I think about them sometimes," Marcus said. "The Zephyrian young. They had families in their way, communities, dreams, maybe. If they could dream individually." "So do I." Torres turned from the window. "But I also think about those children playing outside, about Sarah's garden, about the fact that humanity still exists to ask these moral questions." Marcus understood. That was the terrible mathematics of command, the calculations that had no clean answers. How do you weigh the extinction of one species against the extinction of another? How do you measure the value of the unknown against the value of the known? "Will you testify?" Torres asked. Marcus looked out at his quiet neighborhood, at the life he had built from the ashes of his military service. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the construction sounds from the new elementary school being built. Life, continuing, growing, becoming something better. "I'll testify," he said finally. "But I'll tell them the truth. All of it." Torres nodded, understanding that the truth was more complex than either condemnation or justification. It was the weight of choice made in impossible circumstances, and the burden of living with the consequences. As she prepared to leave, Marcus realized that the nightmares might finally have a purpose. Perhaps it was time to stop running from what he had witnessed and start helping humanity understand the price of its survival. The congressional hearing room felt smaller than Marcus had expected. The curved walls and soft lighting were designed to feel welcoming, but the weight of history pressed down like a physical force. Behind the panel of 5 representatives sat the cameras that would broadcast his words across human space, to colonies and outposts that had never known war. Marcus had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, reviewing classified documents that he hadn't seen in over a decade. The details came back with disturbing clarity. The tactical reports, the casualty estimates, the moment-by-moment decisions that had shaped humanity's darkest hour. Representative Elena Vasquez, the committee chair, opened the session with practiced solemnity. "Mr. Chen, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. Your service record shows you were present at the Battle of Centauri Prime, where the neural disruptor weapon was first deployed on a planetary scale." "That's correct," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "In your own words, can you describe what you witnessed?" Marcus looked out at the gallery where Sarah sat in the front row. She had insisted on coming, despite his protests. Her presence anchored him as he began to speak. The Zephyrian defense of Centauri Prime was unlike anything we had encountered before. They had turned the planet itself into a weapon. The atmosphere was filled with biological agents that could rewrite human DNA in real time. Soldiers were being converted into hybrid creatures that served the Zephyrian collective. Representative Williams, a young man from the Mars colonies who had never seen combat, leaned forward. Could conventional weapons not have resolved the situation? No, sir. We had lost 40,000 troops in the first week. The Zephyrians weren't just fighting us, they were absorbing us. Every human they captured became a weapon against humanity. Marcus paused, remembering faces that had belonged to friends before the conversion process. Command estimated that without intervention, the entire invasion force would be turned against Earth within 30 days. So the neural disruptor was deployed as a last resort. That was the justification, yes. Marcus chose his words carefully. But we knew there were risks. Dr. Reyes had briefed command on the possibility of cascading neurological collapse across the Zephyrian network. Representative Chen, no relation despite the shared name, spoke up. Are you saying command knowingly risked committing genocide? The question hung in the air. Marcus had wrestled with this exact issue for 15 years, and he still wasn't sure he had the right answer. I'm saying command made a decision under impossible circumstances. We were facing extinction. The Zephyrian bioweapons had already sterilized 12 worlds. Their reproductive rate was exponential, and they were adapting to our countermeasures faster than we could develop new ones. But the neural disruptor killed civilians, Representative Liu pressed. Billions of non-combatant Zephyrians died when their collective consciousness collapsed. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the moment the weapon had fired. The Zephyrian forces had simply crumpled, as if invisible strings holding them upright had been cut. But it hadn't stopped there. Across the planet, in cities and settlements they had never targeted, the effect had spread like ripples in a pond. The Zephyrian species didn't distinguish between civilian and military the way we do, Marcus said slowly. Their entire civilization was built on shared consciousness. Every individual was connected to every other individual through quantum-entangled neural networks. When we severed those connections, you killed them all, Representative Vasquez said quietly. Not just on Centauri Prime. The effect propagated through their quantum communication networks to every Zephyrian world, every ship, every outpost in space. In 17 minutes, we ended their species. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus could hear the soft hum of recording equipment, the quiet breathing of observers, the weight of history settling into the official record. Do you believe, Representative Williams asked finally, that this action was morally justified? Marcus had known this question was coming, but it still hit him like a physical blow. How do you answer for the extinction of an entire species? How do you weigh the lives of the known against the lives of the unknown? I believe, Marcus said carefully, that the people who made that decision were trying to save humanity from extinction, whether that justifies what happened. I've been asking myself that question every day for 15 years. And what answer have you reached? Marcus looked at Sarah again, drawing strength from her steady gaze. I think the wrong question is whether it was justified. The right question is whether we learned anything from it. Representative Chen frowned. Could you elaborate? The Zephyrians weren't evil. They were trying to survive just like us. Their bioweapons and conversion techniques weren't acts of malice. They were how their species had always interacted with other life forms. They probably thought they were helping us by trying to integrate us into their collective. Marcus stood, needing to move as the memories pressed closer. We went into that war thinking in terms of human morality, human concepts of right and wrong. We never really tried to understand who they were or what they wanted. We just saw a threat and responded with overwhelming force. Are you suggesting the war could have been avoided? I'm suggesting that maybe, if we had tried harder to communicate, to understand their perspective, we might have found another way. Marcus returned to his seat. But that's easy to say now in hindsight. At the time, with billions of human lives at stake, Command had to make decisions based on incomplete information. Representative Liu looked through her notes. You mentioned learning. What lessons do you think humanity should take from the Centauri campaign? Marcus thought about the question that had haunted him through 15 years of civilian life. That victory and genocide can look exactly the same from certain angles. That the methods we use to survive shape who we become as a species. And that the real test of our humanity isn't whether we can win wars, it's whether we can live with how we won them. Do you suffer from what we won, Mr. Chen? The question came from Representative Vasquez, and it was gentler than the others, more personal. Marcus appreciated the honesty of it. Yes, every day. I wake up screaming sometimes because I remember what it sounded like when 37 billion minds went silent at once. I remember the looks on the faces of my fellow soldiers when we realized what we had done. I remember the celebrations back on Earth when news of the victory arrived and how wrong they felt. He paused, gathering himself, but I also remember the children playing in my neighborhood. I remember that humanity still exists to ask these questions, to struggle with these moral complexities. The Zephyrians don't get to struggle anymore. We took that from them. Given everything you know now, Representative Williams asked, would you make the same choice again? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. It was the question that lived at the center of his nightmares, the calculation that could never be solved with clean mathematics. If I had to choose between human extinction and Zephyrian extinction, I think I would make the same choice. But I would spend every day for the rest of my life trying to make sure humanity never faced that choice again. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, but those words would be the ones that made headlines across human space. Marcus Chen, the soldier who had witnessed genocide, choosing humanity while mourning the price of that choice. 6 months after his testimony, Marcus found himself standing in a place he had never expected to visit. The Zephyrian Memorial Garden on Luna was still under construction, its crystalline spires reaching toward Earth like frozen tears. The memorial had been controversial from the moment it was proposed. Many argued that humanity shouldn't memorialize an enemy that had nearly destroyed them. Marcus disagreed. He had helped design part of the memorial complex. His expertise in habitat construction finally finding a purpose that felt like redemption rather than just survival. Dr. Elena Reyes stood beside him, both of them watching as construction crews installed the final neural resonance chambers. At 78, she was one of the few people alive who understood the technical details of what the neural disruptor had actually done. She was also one of the few people who carried a burden similar to his own. "Do you think they would approve?" she asked quietly, gesturing toward the memorial. Marcus considered the question. The Zephyrians had communicated through complex harmonic frequencies that humanity was still learning to interpret. The memorial included chambers where visitors could experience approximations of Zephyrian collective consciousness, carefully limited experiences that wouldn't risk the psychological damage of full neural integration. "I think they would understand the attempt," Marcus said finally. "Maybe that's enough." The media coverage of his congressional testimony had been intense, but ultimately productive. Rather than the partisan finger-pointing many had expected, the hearings had sparked a genuine conversation about military ethics, first contact protocols, and humanity's responsibilities as an expanding interstellar species. Marcus had received thousands of messages from across human space. Some called him a hero, others a war criminal. But the ones that mattered most came from fellow veterans who finally felt permission to speak about their own experiences, their own struggles with what they had done and witnessed. A support network had emerged from those conversations, not just for Centauri veterans, but for anyone grappling with the moral complexity of humanity's expansion into space. Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial counselor, helping others navigate the weight of impossible choices made in impossible circumstances. Sarah joined them at the memorial site, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the patient smile that had sustained Marcus through his darkest periods. She had become an advocate in her own right, pushing for better mental health resources for military personnel and their families. "The first tour groups arrive tomorrow," she said, handing cups to Marcus and Dr. Reyes. "Are you ready for that?" Marcus wasn't sure he would ever be ready to guide civilians through the memorial, to help them understand what had happened at Centauri Prime. But he had committed to leading tours one day a week, sharing his first-hand perspective on events that were already becoming simplified in history books. "Ready or not," he said, "it's important work." Dr. Reyes sipped her coffee, her eyes focused on the Earth rising beyond Luna's horizon. "You know, I've been working on something new. A way to detect collective consciousness networks before we encounter them. If we ever meet another species like the Zephyrians, we'll have options besides genocide," Marcus finished. "That's the hope." The three of them stood in comfortable silence, watching Earth turn slowly in space. Somewhere on that blue marble, children were playing in parks that existed because of choices made in the fire of war. Those children would inherit the burden of those choices, along with the responsibility to make better ones. Marcus thought about the recurring nightmare that still woke him most nights. But lately, the dream had begun to change. Instead of ending with the terrible silence of 37 billion minds going dark, it continued. In the new version, he found himself standing in the memorial garden, surrounded by the harmonic frequencies that had once carried Zephyrian thoughts and dreams. In the dream, he could almost hear them. Not words, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe forgiveness. He wasn't sure which would be harder to bear. A construction worker approached their group, tablet in hand. "Mr. Chen? We're ready for your final approval on the central chamber design." Marcus followed the worker into the heart of the memorial, where the main resonance chamber was nearly complete. This was the space where visitors would experience the closest approximation possible of Zephyrian collective consciousness. A carefully calibrated simulation that would let them feel for just a moment what it might have been like to share thoughts and emotions with billions of other minds. The chamber was beautiful in its alien geometry, all flowing curves and crystalline surfaces that seemed to bend light in impossible ways. When activated, it would hum with harmonics, derived from recordings made during first contact before the war began. "It looks right," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure how he knew that. Something about the space felt appropriate, respectful of what it represented. As they walked back toward the lunar transport station, Dr. Reyes spoke quietly. "Do you think we're honoring them, or just making ourselves feel better?" It was a question Marcus had wrestled with throughout the memorial's development. Was this genuine remembrance, or just an elaborate form of survivor's guilt? "Maybe both," he said. "But I think the intention matters. We're not trying to excuse what happened or pretend it was somehow noble. We're trying to remember that they were people, different from us, but people nonetheless." Sarah took his hand as they walked. "And we're trying to make sure it never happens again." Marcus nodded, thinking about the detection systems Dr. Reyes was developing, the new first contact protocols being taught at military academies, the cultural exchange programs being established with the handful of other spacefaring species humanity had encountered since the war. The work was slow and often frustrating. Bureaucracy moved at the speed of caution, and there were still those who argued that humanity's survival justified any methods necessary. But change was happening. One policy revision and one conversation at a time. When they reached the transport station, Marcus looked back at the memorial one more time, Tomorrow, he would begin the difficult work of helping others understand what had happened at Centauri Prime. He would tell them about the impossible choices, the weight of survival, and the cost of victory. But he would also tell them about the children playing in his neighborhood, about the gardens growing on colony worlds, about the future that existed because someone had made the hardest choice imaginable. The transport arrived, sleek and silent against Luna's airless sky. As they settled into their seats for the journey home, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was a keeper of difficult truths, a guardian of uncomfortable memories. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had chosen. And for the first time since Centauri Prime, that felt like enough. The Earth grew larger in the viewport as they descended through the atmosphere, blue and green and alive with possibility. Somewhere below, the next generation was learning about the war in history classes, asking the same questions that had haunted their parents and grandparents. Marcus hoped they would find better answers than his generation had, but until they did, he would keep telling the story, bearing witness to what humanity could become when pushed to its absolute limits. The weight of that responsibility no longer felt like a burden. It felt like hope.